it was impossible, because although we had hundreds of thousands of people, I would say, outside the US Embassy protesting about the US invasion, it kind of stopped there. People then didn't go on to talk about fair trials.
The crimes that these people were alleged to have committed and were seen to have committed, and for which they were convicted, were quite heinous, and particularly the killing of the four in cold blood. If there'd been a military conflagration and people had died in it, it's a bit different, but in the instance of the death of Maurice Bishop particularly, that went down badly. It was something that shouldn't have happened, and the people of Grenada will always hold those that are in jail accountable for that.
The easiest thing would have been Maurice Bishop was popular, we all loved and adored him, and you couldn't have had the sophistication to say, well, you know, something's wrong here, let's wait. But along the line, as the trial happened and the appeal and the treatment of them, you then start to realise, well, you're right, you know, this is a travesty of justice. There is a major attack on human rights here, and how come people can't see it? And what's interesting, even friends and family of mine who are hostile to the men would say, well, yes, no, there is a travesty here. We know that. There's no question about that. We still think that there's no answer, though, about who it was who killed Maurice Bishop and why did that go so wrong. We want answers about that.
When I was in Grenada in 1995, I did talk to some people then about the possibility of these people being released. And bear in mind, this is 10 years after the sentence has been handed down. And they were adamant that these people should never be released. That was the opinion I was getting from the majority of people I spoke to, and they were saying that that is the feeling of the majority of people in the island at the time.
The big issue for us, the big crisis for us, was when Castro made a speech and denounced them, and then all of the left internationally followed, because if there's an issue in the Caribbean, who's the spokesperson? It's Castro, and who are we going to listen to? It's Castro. We were totally isolated. It was a small group of us. And I was going to speak. I was being invited to speak on lots of platforms, and I was absolutely petrified. I was about 19 or 20, I think. Absolutely, and you know, and sometimes I'd be on a platform, as I was the other day, next to Tony Benn, and I thought, oh my God, what on earth can I say? So it was quite scary, but you learn very fast, and you know, you're thrown in. I was kind of like thrown in. Fortunately, lots of the right people have decided, nope, something's wrong, we've got to do something about it, and Amnesty fall into that group. And then we as there were organisations, I mentioned Caribbean Labour Solidarity earlier on, Liberation, there were fantastic organisations, lots of grassroots organisations, all sorts of groups that you've never heard of would come out of the woodwork, and you know, and each year somebody, a new individual, you know, Alan, Noreen and Jean, and the new individuals would join us, and so that kept us going, I think.
For many years, the islanders and the Grenadian courts and authorities have opposed release and been unreceptive to allegations of injustice. These were the most fruitless years of the campaign, as the case was locked in legal stalemate. Then, things began to change.
Well, much of what I wanted to say has already been said, and much better. There are two issues really here. One is the case of Grenada, the invasion, the legacy, the trial, and the other is the broader question of US imperialism. Now, I think the American case for invading is perfectly straightforward. They were afraid that Cuban influence was growing and Grenada was an instrument for it, and you might find left-wing ideas getting a broader influence there. The murder of Maurice Bishop was the excuse. I think the truth is the United States feels they're entitled to intervene anywhere, anytime they like. Mrs. Thatcher, who was after all had the Commonwealth responsibilities, she was told by Reagan a few hours before he invaded. And she did a broadcast. I mean, I can't believe this. Thatcher, you might think it was George Galloway. She said, I'm totally and utterly against communism and terrorism, she said on the BBC. But if you're going to pronounce a new law that wherever communism reigns against the will of the people, the United States shall enter, then we're going to have really terrible wars in the world. That was Mrs. Thatcher, not George Galloway.
And I hadn't actually realised the full extent of the US invasion, even though I am a Grenadian and had family. I was actually out of the island at the time, but had family there, and my parents' house was bombed. There was some 7,000 US troops, several thousand troops in reserve, including 1,000 from the Caribbean islands, although they didn't fight. And I gather from the US State Department that the war cost some $80 million US dollars.
When I was over there as part of the appeal hearing, we were told we couldn't call it the invasion, we had to refer to it as the mercy mission. And then when I said that, are you American? I said, no, I'm English. Oh yeah, the invasion. Even that was what people were being instilled to say.
The Amnesty report is very important, and it is essential reading for everybody in Grenada. The situation we have, however, is this, that as a result of what has torn that island apart, the majority of the people are unconcerned about the extent to which these events that Amnesty deals with are effectively the worst examples of the erosion of our basic and fundamental rights. They are not interested in that.
How will the people of the island of Grenada be healed, and those abroad and other places who are suffering that way, so that some type of amnesty could be brought out with some great understanding? Is that the general consensus? Is that what you feel? Sorry? That's the process.
Over time, it becomes clear that legal complexities and appeals are not the only issues to be confronted for the freedom of the 17 to be achieved. Another agenda emerges around the island population's need for healing from the trauma of October 1983 and their need for answers to the mysteries of the 19th of October. Who ordered the executions? And what happened to the bodies of those who were slain?
The fundamental and irredeemable error in all of this was that quite reckless and insane decision to put Maurice Bishop under house arrest. The future, the fate of those 17 people cannot be isolated from all of that stuff.
I feel very upset the very fact that the US propaganda did such a good job. There was an awful lot of support for Maurice Bishop. He was a very charismatic person, and I suppose people are still hurting. There's still a lot of questions that haven't been answered. And it's easy to say, oh, Bernard Cord, the Cord gang are all responsible.
It's important to remember that the events of October 1983 were tragic for the Grenadan people. A very popular Prime Minister was murdered. Many other people were injured or lost their lives. The atmosphere on the island was one of grieving, was one of great upset, was a very traumatised place. When the invasion happened, and after that, the anger that their people felt, understandably, at the loss of their loved ones and some of their leaders, very much directed itself towards the 17. And Amnesty International fears this has infected and affected their fair trial rights.